Content warning. This story includes references to sexual violence and physical punishment. Sensitive readers, please take care. 1852. The night two sisters gave birth together, and 6 years later one truth would turn the plantation upside down. Imagine a humid Alagoas night so thick it seemed to press the stars into the sugarcane. The air smelled of cutting, green cane sticky with sap, and the faint ghost of rum from the kitchen. Lantern glow pooled against clay walls. Men's boots left dark prints on the packed earth. On a plantation called Boa Esperança, the big house, Casa Grande, sat high on its little hill like a promise the land never kept. Below, in the cramped rows of the senzala, the slave quarters, voices rose and fell like the tides. The soft counting of stitches, a lullaby half-whispered, a cigarette passed from hand to hand. In one of those low, crowded rooms, two women labored side by side. Firmina was the older sister by a few years, a woman whose hands had learned the secret geography of the plantation, how the cotton would snag on a certain nail, which path had a patch of shade midday, where the dogs slept. She had a quick, weary smile and a way of remembering small things, names who owed whom a favor, that made her useful. Beside her, Lorinda pressed her forehead to a wooden beam and breathed like she was learning a new language. Lorinda was younger, her laughter still bright when it came, the kind of person who could make a child forget to be afraid for a moment with a song. Tia Jacinta, the old midwife and wise woman, moved between them like a slow tide. She smelled of menthol and cassava, and her hands were both fierce and gentle. When she touched a belly, the room stilled as if the world itself were listening. There was no ceremony here, only the hush of women and the crude luxuries they had built for themselves. A strip of patched cloth ritually washed and softened, a tin cup for water. Firmina and Lorinda had been taken to Boa Esperança years before. The plantation's owner, Coronel Ignacio Tavares, ruled with the soft cruelty of someone who measured weight in profit and people in labor. Under him worked Damião, the feitor, the overseer, who kept the numbers straight and the punishment swifter than water. There were things everyone at Boa Esperança knew but did not name aloud. The way a man in authority lingered too long where a girl fetched water, the dread that stopped someone mid-song because their eyes had met one of the masters at the house window. Words were weapons here. Silence was barter. On that night in 1852, the two sisters pushed and breathed and summoned whatever courage heat and pain could not take. When the first child came, Firmina's son, he looked at the world with eyes so startlingly light they made the room gasp. Green, Tia Jacinta said, green as a new leaf. His skin was a softer hue than anyone expected, more like someone from the town than from the quarters. They named him Gabriel, for a bird that might carry messages. Lorinda's child arrived almost as the moon leaned higher. Dark, dense with life, the infant's skin glowed in the lantern light. She was small, but solid, as if the night itself had pressed her full of tiny, stubborn heart. They called her Esperança, hope, because there seemed no other honest name that fit. It did not take long for the eyes around the plantation to register the difference between the babies. On Boa Esperança, difference always meant a map. Who could sit on the stairs of the Casa Grande for a minute's shade? Who fetched bowls for the master's table? Who slept with a blanket? The subtle gradations of color threaded through daily life like a secret ledger. Gabriel's lighter skin and sea-green eyes made him an immediate, inescapable curiosity in the Casa Grande. He was small enough to be lifted, and his face seemed familiar to those who watched the house, so familiar that a servant for the kitchen would sometimes stop mid-task and stare as if remembering a tune. The cause of those infants' faces, how they came to be, whose hands had made their mothers pregnant, was a subject the women did not speak of, except in the narrowest of ways. There had been assaults, brutal and quiet in different times. Damião had a reputation for his appetite, and Coronel Ignacio had authority to take what he wanted when he wanted it. But these were not stories told and retold at night. They were like the roots of an old tree, buried, complex, feeding pain into every branch. When the truth pressed close, the women did what they had always done. They turned it into something survivable. Firmina took care of Lorinda. Lorinda kept one hand on Firmina's arm, when something heavy drifted past their door. Tia Jacinta moved differently with both babies. She wrapped Esperanza's tiny shoulders in cloth and hummed a tune that had no name, a tune for protection. For Gabriel she put a little scrap of ribbon, no one would say why, and told him, in a voice only he would hear, that he must learn to speak soft and quick, that the world would try to pin him with a name he did not choose. The house watched with its own slow hunger. Eulalia, the coronel's wife, was a woman who had married into a heavy house where appearances were currency. She knew the codes, how to sit, how to look displeased without making a spectacle of emotion. But within her there were fissures. Some nights she would go to the upstairs window and look out over the estate, hands folded so tightly her knuckles whitened, and the look that crossed her face could, at moments, be tenderness or calculation. People said she had lived with grudges as one lives with an old shawl, familiar, warming one shoulder until you cannot remember why you first took it up. These early months shaped the children's rhythm. Gabriel spent afternoons at the edge of the Casa Grande, where a nurse, an older servant, taught him to hold a spoon without smudging his face. He was taught to stand straight, so he would not take up unnecessary space when visiting gentlemen came by. Esperanza ran barefoot through the Cenzala, the other children making crowns of palm fronds for her, but also noticing how work found her first. She would fetch water, churn the butter, and sit with Lorinda when the sun dipped below the cane. She learned names like birds learn migration, by the feel of the season. Privilege at Boa Esperança was a small, insidious thing. A lighter child got a patch of shade, a darker child got the better place at the fire to stay warm. Gabriel's small advantages were petty but persistent, leftovers that fell into a cup like crumbs. The cook would let him lick a spoon. Someone from the house might drop him an extra biscuit. For Esperanza there was a different kind of attention, sharper, wary. Eyes would come to rest on her face and hold a question. Whose child are you? That question hung in the air like a heat mirage, impossible to catch, but impossible to ignore. As the years moved, the plantation's rhythms carved grooves into people's lives. There were harvests and lean months, baptisms and funerals, a steady procession of births and deaths that made grief familiar and hope a small, definable thing. Coronel Ignazio kept accounts and men. He measured men and women in efficiency. He was not a man of constant cruelty in the way a storm is constant. He had intervals of cruelty that were considered part of the business. But Damião, the fighter, was the kind of man who enjoyed the mechanics of a threat, the look, the step forward, the memory made into a warning. He would cross a palm with a hand and claim it was for the good of the cane, for order. Under that pressure, family formations shifted. Women guarded each other's children with a ferocity that could seem like foolishness to anyone who had not known the cost of a lost one. Fermina and Lorinda stitched a private economy of favors, a cup of milk slipped to a neighbor's baby, a watchful pair of hands that would distract a master if he lingered too long. Within the Senzala, laughter mingled with sorrow, and the two were hard to separate. They traded stories, recipes, and small talismans, seeds, scraps of cloth, objects that contained the dignity of a life they were told belonged to someone else. The sun rose higher, then lower. Gabriel learned to carry trays in the house without shaking. He learned the inflection the masters liked, the silence they required. Esperanza learned to read the sky for rain, and to find a hollow where a tub could be hidden from prying eyes. Both children learned the rules of an unjust world early, where to walk to slip under notice, how to make a laugh sound useful and not defiant. Tia Jacinta taught all of them what she could. In the narrow hours after work, she would take the children and tell them about roots and leaves, about herbs that soothed a cough, and words that could steady a mind. She taught them songs in a low voice, and sometimes she would speak of freedom in the most careful of ways. Freedom as a seed that might be planted carefully, because sudden talk could dig a grave. To the children, she gave a vocabulary not of rights but of escape routes, a way to earn a watchman's favor, a trade to learn that might be useful in a town, a paper one day that would prove a point. Those little lessons would matter later, but they could not erase what the plantation structure had done. It had insisted daily and cruelly on the difference between the children. As the 6th year spun toward its close, those differences hardened into something like destiny. Gabriel received positions at the house that put him under the gaze of the family. He polished silver with a precision that earned a curt nod. He sat near the front porch and watched the river of visitors come and go. That visibility brought him a new kind of hazard, the curious glances that tested what his presence might mean. Men would joke in a low voice about family lines and genes. Women would glance at him with a mix of pity and speculation. Those speculations became a slow, dangerous rumor. Esperança grew in the quarters, like a plant reaching for a patch of sun. She was beloved among the other children for a bravery that had nothing theatrical about it. She could fend off a child twice her size with the irresistible stubbornness of someone protecting a sibling. Her hands were always busy, mending, sweeping, washing, small calluses like badges. People took note of her laugh and the way her eyes kept track of the older ones in the household. She had a dignity in work that made other people's privilege look shaky, as if the house might be propped up and suddenly reveal itself as only boards and paint. The plantation's calendar marked a particular December for its heat and its business. December was a month when owners often took stock, when men who bought and sold people visited estates to look for laborers to carry cane in other provinces. On the morning a trader from Maceió arrived, there was a heat that rubbed at the nerves. Such a visit was an unspoken threat running down the spine of the plantation. Today, someone might be reassigned, taken away, sold off like an object. Word had narrowed in whispers. Coronel Inácio wanted to trim the workforce. Debts had to be balanced. Damião, who liked to be seen in the company of the merchant, scuttled through the yard with the confident, almost theatrical gait of a man who expected complications to bow out before him. The men who kept ledgers glanced at lists. They pointed out names. Panic fluttered through the senzala like a bird skittish on a wire. There were rules for an auction, though no formal scaffold was set that morning. The owner would pick the ones who could be spared. The fighter would point, and the merchant would appraise. It was a ritual of terror and humiliation, inspection of bodies, forced display, murmured valuations, and the very idea of it turned the stomach. On the day the trader came, the quarters were a study in small signs. Women smoothing the way their hair lay, which was an invented dignity, and men holding their posture as if it were a shield. The children were kept close. Firmina's hands trembled, like someone playing a tune whose notes wouldn't come. Lorinda clung to Esperança's braid, each knot a prayer. They were called one by one to stand on the raised log where the overseer liked to conduct business, but fate does not always follow a plan. The merchant from Maceió blinked owlishly at the crowd, appraised the lot presented, and then asked for those who were house-grown, meaning men and women who had learned tasks close to the Casa Grande and could be of use anywhere, makers of sweetmeats, men who tended mules. Damião pointed with a practiced hand, naming names like a man reciting a list. When the overseer reached toward the senzala's darker corner, he stopped. There, like a tide caught against a rock, something shifted. Esperança stood smaller than the men who gathered, but somehow she commanded a look that made even the merchant's brow twitch. The fighter, looking for profit, gestured as if to suggest she might fetch a respectable price. Then Eulalia moved. She had been in the shade of the veranda and watched the proceedings quietly, a pale figure in linen, her hat folded back to show a face set like a coin. For a moment she said nothing. People expected in such moments a cool calculation, a wife protecting her household, a woman preserving her comfort. But what she did shocked the rhythm of the place. Eulalia swept forward, the linen of her dress whispering against the houseboard. She faced the crowd with a look like someone who had decided to unmask something. Her voice, when she spoke, had the strange authority of someone making a choice that would break the air in the yard. She said plainly for all to hear that Esperança was her husband's daughter. The announcement landed with the force of a statement that rewrote a map. Silence pooled like water. For a moment, every face froze in a different kind of disbelief. Some mouths opened, some hands clenched. Gabriel, who had been watching from the stair, felt something cold spread through him like a shadow. No one had expected Eulalia to speak so. No one had expected her to claim such a thing publicly. Her words were not a whisper, but a declaration, and their meaning unspooled immediately. If Esperança was the colonel's child, she could not be sold off like a field slave. Such a sale would scandalize the household, raise questions that couldn't be easily closed. The merchant from Maceo blinked and made polite noises you made when someone shifted the ground beneath you. Damien's face went a color that had nothing to do with the sun. But the meaning of Eulalia's words cut in two directions at once. For Esperança it seemed a lifeline, sudden, precarious, perhaps false, but a lifeline nonetheless. For Lorinda, for Fermina, for the other women who had suffered in silence, it felt like being pushed to the edge of something unknowable. A truth like that unmoored more than one life. People crowded near, voices rising like disturbed birds. Some whispered that Eulalia wanted to spare her reputation. Others said she sought revenge, a way to rebalance some old hurt. But the immediate effect was concrete. The merchant, for the moment, paused his business. The coronel, who had been overseeing the auction with the diffuse air of a man accustomed to command, stood as if his ribs had been rearranged. He stared at his wife, then at the child. His face was the meeting of thunder and calculation. Damien, whose violence often hid behind a neat uniform of efficiency, stepped forward. His jaw tightened. No one could predict what Damien would choose. His sense of ownership over the plantation and its people felt personal as skin. For him, Esperança's new status was an affront and a puzzle. If the colonel's blood ran in her, what did that say about the rule he had helped keep? In the crowd, some dared to hope. An older woman put a hand to her mouth and whispered to Fermina, "Praise be." Others held their breath, waiting for the house to decide whether to close ranks or to split open. Fermina's heart tripped like a trapped bird. She felt both a strange relief, one less immediate danger to the child who slept against Lorinda, and a deeper dread. Revelation could cut ways no one had foreseen. To be spared by the master's wife might mean a protection built on the very idea that something had been stolen. It might mean new bargains, new humiliations. Eulalia's voice was steady as she announced more than once that Esperança would not be sold. Her words carried with them the ring of a woman who had weighed consequence and chosen to break the code of silence. Whether from compassion or calculation, she had made herself public in a way few on the plantation had seen. People who had long folded their knees in the small darkness of necessity felt a sunlight they had not invited fall upon them. But the light was complicated. It exposed scars. Coronel Inacio's face hardened. There was an immediate shift in the yard, as if everyone had been given new instructions mid-task. He did not strike then. The social dance of honor and shame made sudden violence brash. Instead, he walked to his wife with the slow, wolfish calculation of a man weighing a chess move. His voice when he spoke was a low thing. He reminded everyone, quietly, almost, of what a public scandal could do to a household. He muttered that the matter would be handled as it should be. Eulalia's answer was simply the look that said, "I have already handled it." Damien's eyes found Fermina and Lorinda, and something ugly passed there that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with ownership. He liked to make people smaller with looks. He took the whisper of a step toward Lorinda and then stopped when the colonel's scowl swept the yard. The merchant, sensing profit drying under his fingers, slowly made excuses and took his leave. A trader without certainty would not risk a household scandal. Around them, murmurs became conversation. People who had been preparing for the worst, the bucket, the sack, the last-minute packing, could not move. Their hands did small, nervous things. A child tried to pick at a seam. A man lit a cigarette. Gabriel stood on the edge of the porch, an invisible line running between him and whatever shelter the Casa Grande might offer. For an instant, new possibilities flickered in his mind like a candle's flame. "She won't be taken," he told himself. For another instant, he felt a pinch of something more complicated, that being spared might mean a life measured in the colonel's rooms rather than the quarters, a life where favors came with strings. Inside, Eulalia closed her hand over the small bundle that had once been Lorinda's staff, and for a moment she was as fierce as any woman defending a child. In a voice more private than she had granted the yard, she told Lorinda and Fermina, who had edged forward, "She will stay." The word sounded like an oath. People read that as mercy. Some read it as ownership rebranded. The reaction swept the Senzala like an eddy. Mothers hugged their children a fraction of an inch closer. Men who had been resigning themselves to the cruel arithmetic of the plantation felt a small, unpredictable hope. Some, who were older and had seen too many mercies turn into new forms of bondage, stayed wary. If that day shifted the map of Boa Esperança, it also threw more shadows into the corners. Eulalia's protection was not an erasure of the past, it was a transformation of it. The plantation had never liked uncertainty. Secrets could be useful. Exposed ones were dangerous. A confession, public or private, rearranged power, and in that rearrangement, some people would gain a strange leverage while others lost the little they had. As the trader's carriage rolled away, dust rising like a pale flag, the yard filled with a new kind of chatter. The children, who had watched adults as weather-beaten cartographers, tried to shape this into a story they could keep. Gabriel clambered down the porch steps and walked through the yard as if trying to understand the territory anew. Esperança, clutching Lorinda's skirt, felt both held and exposed in a way words failed to contain. Tia Jacinta, who had watched more seasons than most, gathered the two sisters under a mango tree at the edge of the property. Her face was a map of lines, laugh lines layered with worry. She put both small palms on their shoulders and said little. The old woman's silence had the weight of counsel. Lorinda's knees trembled as if she had just climbed a steep hill. Firmina pressed her mouth thin, learning already the shape of restraint. "Be careful of the light," Tia Jacinta murmured. She had always passed on warnings clothed as advice. Light is blessing, and it is also a lens. It reveals what others will take from you. That night, the senzala smelled different. Smoke, and the sweet fatigue of a day spent worried. The women stitched by lamplight, their needles clicking like distant rain. Men sat with their hands empty and their mouths working at plans they were not yet ready to speak aloud. In the Casa Grande, Coronel and wife shared a look that meant the household's map had new borders. It meant gossip would travel like fever through the region. It meant that a name, Esperança, would now carry with it a dangerous pedigree. For the children, the revelation burned like a small coal in the center of every conversation. Gabriel slept fitfully, dreaming of doors half open to him, and woke with a tightness in his chest that tasted like promise and threat. Esperança lay curled against Lorinda, hand finding a braid she had learned to touch like a pulse. Neither could know the full consequences of the day. They were 6, and 6 is a year when a child feels the world as hollow and absolute. But life does not pause to accommodate revelations. Dawn came with the same hard business of chores. The sugar cane needed cutting, the animals needed tending, the ledger called for accounts. People put their bodies to work because if you stopped a single hour too long, the system would claim you. Still, the news of Eulalia's declaration spread beyond the plantation boundaries. Couriers, idle men, and gossiping women carried a story that would make its way into taverns and kitchens in the nearby town. On the riverbank that evening, men exchanged the rumor like a coin to be weighed. Some offered opinions, pity, scorn, a sense of scandal, shaped by their own needs. Within that swell of talk, Firmina found herself feeling both naked and oddly stronger. She had always been a woman who kept a ledger in her head, noting who owed favors and who might be called on in an emergency. Now the scales had tilted in a way she had not predicted. A wave of questions rose inside her. Would the colonel act to protect only Esperança, leaving Lorinda more exposed? Would Eulalia's declaration bring the family closer, or would it expose fissures that would cut deeper than the cane knives? If the colonel acknowledged a child, what debts would that acknowledgement demand? Across the yard, Damien's resentment smoldered. He had long taken a grim satisfaction in reminding people of their place. The idea that the plantation might be forced into a new etiquette by an admission from the lady of the house angered him in a way he could not name. For him, it was a challenge to authority he had helped maintain. For his part, Coronel Inácio had been forced into a posture no man likes, to be seen as fallible, or worse, as deceptive. Power had always assumed control. Now power had to justify itself under the light it had usually kept for itself. That night the plantation breathed differently. The air was the same humid press of Alagoas, but within it, small fires of speculation and fear burned. People who had once counted coup against the plantation's cruelty, by surviving another season, began to count differently. The ledger in the big house would be rewritten. Obligations would be weighed anew. For the first time in years, Some held in their hands a possibility that looked like a path towards something called protection. For others, that same turning promised deeper penalties. Fermina sat by the small window and watched the lanterns in the Casa Grande blink out one by one. The stars looked indifferent. She touched Gabriel's hair and counted the soft points on his scalp as if each were a bead. Lorinda slept in the room across the narrow corridor, but their shoulders both twitched with questions neither would ask aloud. If Eulalia had declared Esperança a daughter of the house, then the sisters had been thrown into a bargain with uncertain terms. The bargain could buy life. It could also cost them their dignity. Tia Jacinta, who had seen similar bargains in different guises, hummed into her sleep. She had taught generations to keep a second hidden chest, one of savings, one of small skills that might be traded. As a way to survive the day, the house decided to change its rules. She had hidden a small tin of coins under the plinth of her bed, and in the mornings she would move them around as if practicing, because sometimes you needed to remember where your secret stores were kept. In the end, the revelation had done something both terrible and almost miraculous. It had lifted the veil on what everyone had tacitly known, exposed a wound that had been sequestered, and in doing so, it created a new lever. That lever could be used to wrench the system open, or it could be used to prop it up in a different form. The way men like Coronel Inácio and Damião handled that lever would mean everything. Days after the public declaration, the plantation hummed with a brittle tension. The colonel moved through his rooms with a slower gait, as if each step measured the cost of words said and not said. Eulalia, for her part, grew quieter in certain ways and bolder in others. She began to ask pointed questions about who had been tasked with certain chores and who had access to the children's rooms. She sat in the parlor and frowned over letters in a manner that suggested she was writing new rules by the day. In the senzala, mothers taught their children new songs with coded lines. Gabriel and Esperança, between the chores and the lessons Tia Jacinta insisted on, counting the names of herbs, the way to fold a shirt so it would lie flat, felt the world rearrange itself like a table being set anew. They noticed small changes, a bowl left out by mistake, a servant glancing with an expression that meant he had been told something. They learned to value both the evident kindnesses and those that hid themselves behind the weight of a name. One evening, as twilight pressed down and the cicadas began their thin orchestras, a hushed meeting took place under the same mango tree. Not all meetings were possible in the light of day. Some things needed darkness so that the land did not overhear. Fermina, Lorinda, Tia Jacinta, and a few other women spoke in half words, their voices a low current. "We can't only wait," Tia Jacinta said, and her voice had a brittle, urgent quality. "Waiting is a slow hunger." Fermina's jaw was set. "If she takes hold in the house, there will be things they will expect of her. We must watch and we must protect what we can." Lorinda's hands, calloused by work, trembling by worry, folded into her lap. "Protecting her might mean less for me and for you," she whispered. "Then we keep the ledger open," Tia Jacinta said. "We make sure someone knows reading, someone knows to carry a message, someone has a secret coin. If the house tries to bargain, we have bargaining power of our own." Those were not words of a neat plan so much as the mapping of a survival ethic, to learn to save, to spread knowledge like seed. They all understood in different ways that the colonel's wife had given them neither freedom nor a clean bill of safety. She had given them a lever. A lever required muscle and cunning to use, and it could break a finger if one used it wrong. Children slept and were rocked by mothers who hummed songs as if to stitch courage into limbs. Gabriel dreamed sometimes of the river in the town of Maceió, a town he had seen in glimpses when the family had sent him on an errand. He imagined, in the hush of night, books, pages full of letters that meant things beyond lists and orders. Sometimes he would steal moments in which he traced a letter in the dust with a stick, and Tia Jacinta would nod, pleased and a little afraid. Esperança, for her part, learned how to move in the spaces between tasks with grace. She picked up the unspoken cues of the Casa Grande, the foot that meant a man wanted quiet, the sudden silence that meant a voice might rise. She found in small acts of care a way to make herself indispensable. She would polish a bowl until a visiting guest stared and said the word that meant everything, good, and in that small approval lay both comfort and the threat of objectification. As the weeks folded into months, the plantation lived with the consequences of Eulalia's public declaration. It drew cloaks tight and sharpened knives. It also made new alliances. Some servants found it convenient to align with the lady of the Casa Grande now, to be in the soft inner ring of a household suddenly alert to reputation. Others tightened their bonds with the Senzala, exchanging favors and vigilance. For Firmina and Lorinda, life became an exercise in small negotiations. They kept their children close, watched who looked too long, and listened. They learned when to speak, when to nod, and when to keep their silence as a shield. They traded watchful glances in the line for water, and sometimes they slept with one eye awake. And the children watched, growing in a world that had just tilted. The twist Eulalia's revelation had been delivered like a thrown stone. Its ripples had not yet settled. Instead they lengthened, promising to reach distant banks. No one on Boa Esperança then could say what those ripples would finally cost or pay. But at the heart of it, in the rooms and the quarter, the core truth remained. Life on the plantation was built on labor and quiet bargains. Love was its own resistance, small and fierce. The sisters wrapped their children in that resistance like blankets. They taught them that lineage could be remade by the courage of the living, that a name might be as heavy as a chain or as light as an oath. When the moon rode high and the plantation sighed into sleep, Tia Jacinta watched the two children from her doorway. She saw the way Gabriel's fingers flexed when he dreamed of letters, and the way Esperanza's chin lifted when she laughed. The old woman breathed a prayer that had no God in it, only longing and calculation, that whatever the colonel's house now planned, the sisters' children might find ways to move beyond the immediate cages. Outside, in the distant hours, a dog barked twice. The cane shook as a wind passed through. Under the mango tree the hush deepened. The plantation slept, but its sleep was not peaceful. The revelation that had exploded through the yard had created a new clock. Time would begin to move on that clock, and with each tick, decisions would be forced into being. The next days would come with new acts, small submissions and small rebellions, threats thinly veiled and bargains offered in private rooms. For now, the yard had only the immediate aftertaste of the revelation: Eulalia's voice, the colonel's incredulous silence, Damião's tightening jaw. The announcement had been made. The world of Boa Esperança had been shifted, and yet the story had not ended. If anything, it had only started to show its edges. If this moment had taught anyone anything, it was that truth could be a dangerous instrument, one that exposed as much as it protected. The sisters learned that a single declaration could save a child from a cart, and could also cast the family into a new kind of visibility that asked for loyalties and sacrifices. They began to count with a grandmother's urgency what they might offer in return: a skill, a secret, a favor kept. When dawn came again, the first workers were called to the fields. The plantation's business resumed: the cutting, the counting, the shifting of goods. But a new tension threaded through those motions, like a voice barely heard singing under the noise of a market. That is where the story pauses for now, not at an ending but at a hinge. A revelation has been made that promises to reshape lives. A boy named Gabriel and a girl named Esperança, born on the same night into different colors, now stand at the edge of new possibilities and new dangers. The consequences of Eulalia's declaration are only beginning. The rest of the year's work, of punishment, bargaining, secret lessons, and brave choices, will decide whether that announcement becomes a doorway or another kind of cage. If this tale of Boa Esperança has caught you, if the quiet rebellions and heavy revelations pull at you, share it with someone who listens for hidden histories. Tell us where you're watching from. These stories hold more when they are heard across far places. The days that followed the announcement moved like a tide, slow in the pushing, sudden in the retreat. The yard returned for a while to its measured tasks: the razor snap of machetes cutting cane, the steady beat of feet in the processing shed, the hush of the Casa Grande as guests were received and manners rehearsed. But under those motions there ran a current that would not be ignored, a private arithmetic of favors, obligations, and quiet strategies. People began to speak in different halves, what could be said aloud and what needed the dark to be safe. It was into that folded world that a small, cruel incident came. Someone in the house noticed a scrap of paper, an odd thing to find in a senzala, folded and tucked into the hem of a shirt that had been mended for Firmina. A servant passing the room saw letters on the paper and assumed the worst, that a slave had been taught to read, that a rule had been broken. Illiteracy was part of the structure. To be accused of learning was to signal a dangerous independence. Accusations travelled faster than evidence. Damião liked opportunities where he could be brutal and appear justified. He found his chance. He strode into the senzala with the authority of a man who measured his power by how much terror he could plant. In the small, crowded space, he tore open sandals, barked questions, and finally seized Firmina by the wrist. The crowd scattered, because force was the language they had been taught to obey. Firmina did not beg. She closed her jaw as if she had a hinge there that would not let her mouth fall open. They dragged her to the yard, and there, in the open where everyone could be made to watch, Damião pronounced the sentence, lashings to remind others of where obedience lay. There was no long explanation, only the ritual of punishment. The blows came, and afterward Firmina was lowered, breathing uneven, face set like stone. The community gathered around her with hands that were both healer and reproach, Tia Jacinta smoothing her hair, women pinching salt into water for the wounds. The physical hurt would scar, the insult being punished for learning cut deeper, because it was an attempt to take away a path to change. Gabriel stood shaking as if he might break. He had seen how words could be instruments of freedom, Tia Jacinta's soft lessons, the way she had traced letters in the dust, and he had been stealing minutes to practice, writing in the margins of a ledger when no one was looking. Firmina's punishment lit something in him like tinder to flame. He could not accept that a scrap of paper would cost his mother her dignity and her body. He nursed anger into a plan. Anger, when focused, can become a tool, and Gabriel, still a child but quick to teach himself, began to assemble one. The plan needed two things, evidence and leverage. Damião, who enjoyed having power that could be exercised with impunity, was not careful in petty theft. He was the sort of man whose greed made him sloppy. The overseer had a small chest of petty receipts and bribes he thought he could hide. Merchants paid him favors, and sometimes he skimmed coins from transactions. On one of those days he miscalculated. A tray of coins meant for a repairman vanished from the housekeeper's ledger, and Damião, who had been seen in the kitchen and near the ledger, tried to smooth the complaint with threats. The house expected that such matters would be handled inside the family circle, off the books and out of sight. Yet the ledger, the physical book kept for the plantation accounts, was not as mobile as he believed. Gabriel had by then become adept at slipping into the house when doors breathed open, and he had watched Damião move with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Tia Jacinta, who still had her own network of favors and small confidences, had once told Gabriel to remember where people's hands lingered. A hand that loves to hide is a hand that will show if you make it sweat, she would say, in a voice that mixed humor and warning. Gabriel took that as instruction. He began to watch, to note where coins went, and to learn what the housekeeper wrote in the margins. He found a pattern, small payments recorded as repairs that did not match any work, a sack said to be purchased that never arrived, signatures in a hand that was not the housekeeper's. Patience became his ally. He learned to keep a ledger of his own, an internal record held in his memory and committed to a page the night he could steal it. When he felt he had enough, Gabriel moved. He walked into the house with the sort of casualness that comes from rehearsed nerve. He carried, tucked in his sleeve, a small scrap of paper on which he had copied a sequence of entries he had found in the plantation ledger. He found the colonel's office and, by luck and careful staging, intercepted the lawyer visiting to consult on a matter of estate accounts. Gabriel presented his evidence, the copied entries, the discrepancies, the names of receipts that led to Damião. He spoke with a clarity that startled the lawyer. He knew how to trace money, and he had the proof. An odd triangle formed in that room, a boy who could read, a lawyer with a duty to his client, and a colonel whose pride had already been rattled. News travels differently when delivered by a hand that cannot be easily ignored. The colonel's reaction had several faces, surprise, anger, and then calculation. For a man who measured people in productivity, theft was both a personal affront and a business problem. Damião, confronted with the documents and with the colonel's cold look, tried bluster and then blame. Even so, the house had to consider optics. If a fighter could be seen to be stealing, the whole household's order could look suspect. The colonel could not bear that. The result was swift in its own slow way. Damião was expelled from the estate. Not executed, there was advantage in showing some mercy when one's reputation needed smoothing, but he was cast out into the world with the shame and the threats that a man of his character would have to face. His departure was not a thunderclap. It was a public humiliation carried out with the measured steps of a man who wanted witnesses. The plantation cheered in its small, cautious way. For Firmina, the relief was immediate, as water after thirst. The overseer gone meant one less hand to strike, one less shadow to fall across the family. Gabriel's act did more than remove Damião. It shifted perceptions. It proved that knowledge could be leverage. It gave Firmina something that had been denied her, a reason to stand taller in front of the house. The colonel, prompted by shame and the need to show himself a just master in the eyes of his peers, signed papers that granted manumission, alforrias, manumission documents, to Firmina and her son. He did it grudgingly, and with the manner of a man who believed he had been forced into generosity. But a signed paper was a signed paper. The house's map shifted again, this time opening a narrow gate. Eulalia watched much of this from behind the genteel curtain of her duties and her own pain. She had not been a simple protector. She had her reasons that were complex and sometimes selfish. But when she saw the way Damião's departure had exposed the frailty of the house's control, something in her hardened into action. She had been writing for weeks, not just letters of social arrangement, but something more private. Illness, which had reached for her like a slow toothache, made her think of legacies. She called for a lawyer who had dealings with the family, and with a hand that trembled yet was precise, she ordered drafts to be drawn, alforrias for Lorinda and Esperança, and provisions to be set aside so that they would leave the estate with a small sum to start life somewhere else. It was a radical act inside a household measured to preserve wealth and reputation. Eulalia's health declined more quickly than anyone expected. The household adjusted to the immobility of a woman who had once managed the parlor like a small court. On a late afternoon, heavy with rain, when the sky had the washed look of something rinsed and forgotten, she called Firmina and Lorinda to her room. The sisters went, their steps precise with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The room smelled of lemon oil and old paper. Eulalia's hands were small and cool. Her face had the unexpected softness of someone finally choosing a direction. "I have left you something," she said in a voice that no longer wanted to hide. She pressed the papers into Firmina's hands, the alforrias and a small note that explained her decisions. An admission, muffled apology, and an instruction that the funds be used to travel to Maxio and to set up a modest home. She did not call what had happened to Lorinda and Firmina by the name many would have liked to hear. She did not claim full atonement. She offered instead legal instruments that would make freedom possible. When Eulalia died shortly after, the reading of her will was a public and ceremonial moment that the coroner could neither control nor avoid. The lawyer read the terms aloud in the parlor, where gentlemen had once discussed crops and marriages. There was an air of theatre to it, a public confession of a household's tangled private life. The colonel, forced into the public sphere of legalities, signed and stamped the documents with the same hand that had once signed accounting sheets and orders. The alforrias, when read, were precise in language and effect. Lorinda and Esperança were to be manumitted. Funds were to be delivered for their transport and establishment elsewhere. The colonel, if anything, looked as though he had swallowed something bitter. The men who had gathered to witness kept their faces businesslike, but their eyes revealing that they had watched a household be unsettled. The combination of the lawyer's reading and the colonel's signing made the family ready for departure. For the sisters and their children, the moment of leaving had been imagined many nights under Tia Jacinta's humming. Now it came as a plan made of real paper and coins. They took nothing extravagant, a small chest with a few linens, Tia Jacinta's treasured tin with a few coppers, and the legal papers that were more valuable than gold. They left the plantation at dawn, in the same kind of cart they'd used to carry cane, but their feet were no longer weighed by chains. The road to Maceió was dusty and uneven, and as the landscape shifted from cane fields to low scrub to the outskirts of the town, their breath was a mixture of relief and trepidation. Maceió was not a fairy tale. It was a bustling port with heat that smelled of sea salt and fermenting fish, with streets where different languages and accents braided together. A small, free black community lived there, and it was into that web that Firmina, Lorinda, Gabriel and Esperança stepped. They rented a crooked house near the market, a place with a porch where you could watch the town and count the boats. The money Eulalia had set aside was not much, but it bought passage, a deposit on the house and the chance to begin. They worked. Firmina used the skills she'd honed mending and sewing to become a dressmaker for women of middling means, stitching hems and repairing collars until her hands ached with honest labor. Lorinda set up a small stall in the market selling prepared foods and woven baskets. Her voice rose in the chorus of traders, and every sale felt like a soft strike against the plantation's old arithmetic. Gabriel found work in a typesetter's shop, an apprenticeship of the sort that was not common but possible in port towns where newspapers and pamphlets circulated. He learned to set type, to ink letters, and to know the smell of fresh paper. For a boy who had once traced letters in the dust, being surrounded by printed words felt like coming home. Esperança attended a small evening school arranged by a community of freed people and sympathetic church workers. Education, which once had been a dangerous secret, became her labor of choice. She studied not as an indulgence but as a sword to cut through ignorance and to open pathways for others. Her hands, which had learned the rhythm of chores, now learned the delicate work of penmanship and the deciphering of maps and ledgers. She took to learning with the manner of someone who had been given a second chance she would not waste. The years that followed were not easy. Money was thin, work was steady but unrewarding. The family ate simple meals, soup, beans, and the occasional fish bought from a neighbor. Illness visited, and they learned to nurse with home remedies passed down through Tia Jacinta's teachings. They argued, rolled in laughter, and survived the kinds of humiliations life reserves for those who have begun again on a small capital. Yet every night, when the market quieted and the lamplight in their small home flickered, they counted successes. A week of paid rent, a dress sewn that brought compliments, a typewritten notice successfully printed and posted. Those were the small stones with which they built a new path. Gabriel's apprenticeship flourished. He learned the names of fonts and the logic of composition. The typesetter, a taciturn man named Señor Amaro, who had little patience for novelty but respect for skill, took to Gabriel's appetite for learning. Gabriel's ability to read and to set type put him in the center of town news. He began to see words as tools that could shape public opinion. He set small handbills that called for meetings of freed people and anonymous notices, pointing to addresses where lectures would be held. The town had its cautious abolitionists, people who spoke quietly about law, about petitions, about the slow unraveling of slavery's legal frameworks. Gabriel listened and stitched himself into that network. Esperança, with her steadiness and the visible gentleness that had once made visitors notice her in the Casa Grande, found her way to a teacher who taught at a small school for the children of freed families. Her natural leadership made her a quick favorite among the younger pupils. She read aloud with a voice that had learned to carry across rooms where servants were apprenticed to disappear, and in her teaching she made her students practice courage as much as grammar. She taught the children songs and how letters could be used to claim things back from a world that had tried to name them for others. Firmina and Lorinda both found a kind of satisfaction, and sometimes exhaustion, in their new trades. They saved small sums. They invested in a single market stall, and then another piece of fabric. Wherever possible, they sent money to help friends still on the edges of plantation life. Their livelihood was modest, but it allowed them to make choices. It offered the dignity of being able to refuse certain jobs, something that had been impossible at Boa Esperança. Time, which had once been measured by harvest cycles, had a new rhythm now. The children grew into teenagers, and then into the first hints of adults. Gabriel, whose skin still drew glances because of its lighter tone, learned to navigate attention in a way that kept him safe and firm. He dated quietly, focusing instead on the apprenticeship and on the network of printers and pamphleteers that clustered near the port. Esperança, whose presence was luminous in a way that made people protective, considered becoming a teacher permanently, someone who could keep opening doors for those behind her. Their lives were not only stitched to labor and learning, they were also tied to a vow they had made when they left the plantation, a vow to help others where they could. This commitment took many forms, sometimes legal aid to free a family member whose papers had been hidden, sometimes money to pay for a small passage out of a dangerous estate, sometimes simply the sharing of a secret route or a favor known from the days of Tia Jacinta's network. They learned the politics of mercy, when to make a public appeal, when to whisper in a lawyer's ear, when to use a letter to shame a proprietor into doing the right thing. Their lives became a small engine of assistance. The years softened edges and hard truths in different ways. The colonel's estate continued its rhythms without them. People said the plantation was the same under new overseers. Damião, who had taken his shame away, resurfaced here and there as rumor, beaten in some town perhaps, or dead to his own pride. The legal papers sat in a chest that Gabriel learned to treat like a reliquary, alforrias being both instrument and memory. They were practical, but also a reminder that the shape of a life can be changed with ink and will. On certain evenings, when the heat dipped and the bay breathed in like a creature easing, the family gathered on the porch. It had become a ritual, a place to recount small victories and to remember the names of those who had not made it. Tia Jacinta, older now, would sit back and watch with a tenderness tempered by pragmatic skepticism. The children, friends and neighbors, would sit and listen as the older generation told the story of Boa Esperança in ways that did not glorify endurance but honored it. Gabriel, now a young man, had learned to read newspapers that carried news of abolitionist petitions and debates in far-off capitals. He clipped articles and pinned them on a corkboard in the typesetter's back room, a collage of ideas and opportunities. He read about other people who were organizing, and his imagination filled with what might be possible if networks of freed people could coordinate across towns. He thought of Lorinda and of those women still living under overseers, and he drafted letters, careful, polite, legalistic, that sometimes ended up pushing a reluctant owner into making a charitable decision. Esperança, meanwhile, found that her presence in a classroom could change a child's life. A boy named Sinha, whose mother had once sewn at Firmina's bench, became one of her most promising pupils. He learned to write an address and then to sign his name. Those small acts, teaching someone to sign their name, felt to Esperança like removing a chain click by click. She kept a list hidden of names of children she wanted to reach with books and lessons, and when Gabriel could spare a pamphlet or two, he would distribute them. The family's modest prosperity grew in an unflashy, stubborn way. There were setbacks, illnesses, lost customers, a brief business slump when a larger competitor opened a stall nearby. But they persevered. Friends they made in Maceió opened doors. A merchant who appreciated Firmina's skill recommended her to ladies with more means. A shipmaster who had once noticed Esperança's politeness sponsored a small library book. Slowly, the chest of coins Tia Jacinta kept under her bed swelled from a trickle to a small stream. Years later, on a porch much like the one where they now sat, the family gathered in the same small circle that had once huddled under the mango tree. Time had softened faces and given them stories to tell. Tia Jacinta was gone by then, laid to rest under a mark of earth near the sea, but her teachings lingered. They spoke not as triumphalists, but as survivors who had crafted a life with the tools they had. Cunning, love, and a refusal to let the past define their children. Gabriel had become a craftsman of letters and an organizer of sorts, someone who could make a notice that opened a meeting and a printed petition that made the town sit up. Esperança had become a teacher in her own right, running a small evening class for girls and boys, teaching reading, arithmetic, and the small civics of how to file for papers and how to stand in a court if it came to it. Firmina's hands had the work-won steadiness of a seamstress, whose garments fit more than bodies. They fit dignity. Lorinda's market stall was a neighborhood institution. People came as much for her stories as for her food. On that porch, under a soft, forgiving light, they reflected on what had happened the night when both sisters had given birth in 1852. They spoke of that humid room in Boa Esperança, and the way two newborns could carry such different futures in their skins. They spoke of Eulalia's declaration, how a single public truth had altered the course of several lives, and of the complicated ways mercy and reputation had been woven together in that moment. They remembered Damião's cruelty and his disgrace. They remembered Fermina's lashes and the sting that had taught Gabriel to move. And always, they returned to the small acts that stitched the present together. A lesson taught quietly under a table, a ledger kept in secret, a coin saved in a tin. Our names were written then, Lorinda said quietly, touching Esperanza's hand. Not by them. We wrote them back. They tried to define us with the force of a hand, Gabriel added, looking at the darkening harbour. But paper and signatures and people's courage, those things changed the map. The children of their village, now young adults themselves, played beyond earshot, their laughter a kind of currency. They were born into a different era than their parents had been, and yet they bore the echoes of the plantation in the kinds of jokes they told, and in the careful ways their mothers taught them to speak. The family had a small, stubborn plan, to keep helping others whenever the opportunity presented itself. They had learned that freedom could be procured by law, and that law in turn could be used by those who had been trained to read it. The alforrias were not mythic absolution, they were tools, and the family handled them as such. To an outsider, their story might look like a fortunate alignment of scandal, generosity, and a boy's courage. It was those things, yes, but also an accumulation of small, deliberate choices over years. The decision to teach a child the alphabet, the choice to keep a ledger that detailed small thefts, the risk of leaving a plantation for a town that promised little. The arc of their lives had been shaped by both violence and a refusal to be defined by it. On quiet nights, Gabriel and Esperanza would walk to the harbour and look at the boats heading out. The world they had known, the closed map of plantations and oversight, was shifting in ways that were slow and unpredictable. News from other provinces came in fragments, petitions for manumission, debates over the law, stories of families who had slipped free in the confusion of conflict. They read these stories with hunger and caution. They knew that theirs was not a universal experience. Many families remained trapped in the old machinery. That recognition gave urgency to their vow to help. If the twist, the public revelation 6 years after the births, had been the fulcrum of the family's journey, the following years had revealed how complicated leverage can be. A confession can save a child from the auction and, at the same time, expose a mother to other humiliations. A husband's signature could be both a deliverance and a reminder of ownership. The family's freedom had been secured not by a single miracle, but by a knot of actions: Eulalia's will, Gabriel's courage, the expulsion of a violent overseer, and the sisters' steady work. Each piece mattered. In the end, what held steady was not simply the legal status they had gained, but the way they chose to live afterwards. They did not hoard their small prosperity. They gave lessons, offered shelter, and lent coins to those who needed them to buy passage or to pay a lawyer's fee. Their house became a modest node in a network of mutual aid. People who had once bent under the weight of chains found ways to stand straighter because of the quiet generosity of a seamstress and a vendor and two young people who had learned to read. One evening, as twilight bled into the sea and the air carried the day's warm breath away, an old woman who had once worked in the house at Boa Esperança visited. She stood on the porch and watched the family for a long while, as if measuring their faces against memories. Then she folded her hands and said simply, "You remembered the names." It was a sentence that needed no further unpacking. Names had been so often taken and reassigned that to remember a true lineage was both an act of love and of defiance. Gabriel thought of the night when Tia Jacinta had traced letters in dust and had told him that a letter carried weight, not because it was made of ink, but because someone could hold it in their hand and say, "This is mine." He thought of the years of small work and of the way justice sometimes arrived as a series of small, stubborn truths. He thought of the two sisters who had given birth on the same humid night in 1852 and of the way fate and courage had braided into an improbable path. If you had been there on the porch as the family spoke and the distant ships listened, you would have seen that their story did not end with a single twist. It continued in the daily tasks that built a life beyond bondage, in the learning of letters, in the rethreading of old garments, in the teaching of a young girl how to sign her name. The twist, the moment Eulalia spoke and the alforias were written, was a hinge. The rest was the opening of a door that required work to cross. Remembering this, Firmina smiled and traced the edge of a hem she was mending. Lorinda stirred a pot on the small stove, and Esperanza called a student who needed help with a difficult passage. Gabriel folded a printed sheet and tucked it into a bundle ready for distribution. A small bulletin that announced a meeting to support families seeking legal aid. They had been given a strange inheritance, not only freedom, but the obligation to do what they could to make freedom a bit more reachable for others. 1852 remained the year that began the story, a year marked by 2 births and by a revelation 6 years later that made the household rearrange itself in ways none of them could have foreseen. The twist was extraordinary because it revealed what had been hidden, and it set into motion a chain of choices that, though painful, produced change. The family's later life was testament to how legal papers, stubborn courage, and the soft economies of solidarity could add up to a life rebuilt from the inside. If this account has stayed with you, pass it on. Share it with someone who listens for the hidden arcs in history and who understands that small acts can redraw a map. Leave a note in the comments about where you are hearing this story from. In gatherings like ours, place and empathy matter.